Hey everyone, and welcome to another deep dive. Today we're going to be like detectives, trying to crack the code of why people do what they do. We're talking functional behavior assessment, or FBA for short. And to guide us on this little adventure, we have the chapter on functional behavior assessment by Stephanie Peterson and Nancy Neef.
We're going to really try to get into the why behind people's actions, especially those head-scratcher behaviors that leave you thinking, what in the world?
Right, like when someone's doing something that just doesn't make sense. Speaking of which, our authors Peterson and Neef use this great example to illustrate. They talk about Stella, who washes her hands before lunch without a fuss. But then there's Flo, who in the exact same situation throws a complete tantrum.
It's a great example of how behavior isn't just random. There's always a function, a purpose behind it.
Yeah, it's like if you walked into a room and saw someone flipping a light switch on and off and on and off. You wouldn't just assume they love the clicking sound. You'd figure there's got to be a reason behind it. Maybe they're trying to get the light to turn on, or maybe they're trying to signal someone in the other room.
Exactly. And that's what FBA helps us do, uncover that reason, that underlying why behind the behavior.
Okay, so how do we actually break down this why of behavior? Well, Peterson and Neef talk about these four main functions of behavior: attention, escape, tangible, and automatic. And don't worry, it's not as clinical as it sounds.
Yeah, let's start with tangible.
Mm-hmm.
Think of that feeling you get when you finally get your hands on that new gadget you've been wanting, or you snag a table at that super popular restaurant everyone's always raving about. It's about getting something you want, and that desire is what drives the behavior.
Okay, so like me desperately wanting another cookie and
Yeah.
asking for it, hopefully politely. That would fall under tangible, right?
Exactly. But then sometimes it's not about getting something, but getting out of something.
Oh, you mean like my talent for suddenly remembering a million chores the second someone mentions folding laundry? That's me escaping having to fold laundry, say.
Procrastination at its finest. And then there's attention, which we all crave to some extent. Think about that kid who acts out every time you're on the phone. They've learned that even negative attention is still attention.
It's like their little formula is, if I do this, I get a reaction. And even a negative reaction is better than being totally ignored.
Precisely. And finally, you've got automatic, these behaviors that are just inherently reinforcing, even if they seem kind of strange to everyone else, like the satisfaction of popping bubble wrap or reorganizing your bookshelf by color.
Okay, see, now I'm with you on the bookshelf thing. I'm a sucker for organization. But here's where it gets even more interesting. The authors point out that the same behavior can actually serve different functions for different people. And the same function can be met by totally different behaviors.
Exactly. And that's why just trying to punish a behavior without understanding the why behind it is like putting a Band-Aid on a broken arm. It might cover up the problem for a little bit, but it doesn't actually address what's really going on.
So someone who's constantly tapping their pen could be doing it for attention.
Right.
Or maybe it's just a sensory thing. Or maybe it's their way of dealing with nervous energy.
And without understanding that why, any solution you come up with is just a shot in the dark.
Okay, so we know behavior has a purpose. It's not just random chaos, but how do we actually figure out what that purpose is? It's like we need our detective hats and magnifying glasses.
Well, that's where the assessment part of FBA comes in. Our authors lay out three main methods: functional analysis, descriptive assessment, and indirect assessment. It's like having different tools to help us examine the evidence.
Okay, let's dive into that. Starting with a heavy hitter functional analysis. That sounds intense.
Yeah, they call it the gold standard because you're really setting up these situations to see what's triggering a specific behavior. They give this example of 8-year-old Marie who was getting aggressive with her family.
So they like stage different scenarios to see what was going on with Marie.
Exactly. But her therapy time was limited. So they decided to mainly focus on tangible reinforcement based on what they already knew from interviews and observations. It turned out that when they gave Marie what she wanted after she acted out, her aggression actually got worse. But when they taught her how to ask nicely, it decreased dramatically.
Wow. So it's like they were accidentally reinforcing the wrong behavior.
Sometimes we are the problem, right?
Definitely. And I can see how setting up these controlled scenarios might not always be easy.
That's true. Functional analysis can be pretty time-consuming and difficult to pull off in real-life situations. That's where descriptive assessment comes in. It's like being a behavior detective in the real world, just observing and recording what's happening naturally.
Oh, so instead of setting up this whole experiment, we're taking notes in real time.
Exactly. The authors talk about Chris, a student who used a wheelchair and didn't have many ways to communicate vocally. They started observing him carefully and noticed a pattern. His screaming usually happened when he was alone, and he was way more likely to get a reaction from staff when he screamed versus when he tried to communicate appropriately.
Oh, wow. So they were basically reinforcing the screaming without even realizing it.
It happens all the time, and that's why this whole ABC thing is so important. Antecedent, behavior, consequence. Got to look at the whole picture.
Right, because if you only see the behavior, you're missing a huge chunk of the puzzle.
And then there's the third method, indirect assessment, which is all about gathering information from interviews, questionnaires, those sorts of things.
So kind of like getting different perspectives on the situation.
Exactly. It's
Yeah.
like gathering intel from people who know the individual really well. But, and this is important, the authors point out that although it's convenient, it's not always super reliable on its own.
Yeah, because people remember things differently and perspectives can be biased.
It's like that friend who always exaggerates their stories. You might get some clues, but you need more concrete evidence to solve the case.
Exactly. So it seems like FBA isn't a one-size-fits-all kind of thing.
You got it. It's all about picking the right approach, or even combining a few based on the person and the situation.
So more like a toolbox than a rule book.
Now you're getting it. For example, there's trial-based functional analysis, a faster version that's great for busy classrooms. They talk about this kid, Carson, who had autism and would often have tantrums during transitions. They tried a few different things and quickly found that a visual timer and a preferred item during those transitions helped a lot.
It's amazing how much of a difference the right approach can make. What about situations where the behavior is so risky that even one instance is too dangerous? I remember reading about a child who would just elope take off running, which obviously can be super dangerous.
Yeah, that's where latency-based functional analysis is useful. Instead of waiting for the behavior to happen over and over, you're focusing on how long it takes for it to start. The book talks about Elijah, a 9-year-old who had eloped from school. They timed how long they could keep him engaged before he tried to run. And that's how they learned that escaping demands and getting attention were big factors.
So instead of trying to chase him down after he takes off, they focused on preventing the running in the first place. That makes a lot of sense. The authors also talk about something called precursor behaviors, what happens right before a challenging behavior occurs.
Oh yeah, like with Will, whose aggression was so intense that even one incident was too risky. They noticed that he would give these subtle verbal warnings right before he'd lash out.
So by paying attention to those warning signs, they could potentially intervene and prevent the situation from escalating. It's like knowing the warning tremors before an earthquake happens.
Exactly. That's what's so powerful about FBA. It helps us understand not just what's happening on the surface, but also those deeper currents driving the behavior.
Okay, so we've got all these different FBA methods, these tools to help us understand behavior. But how do we actually use all this to make things better?
Yeah.
It's like we solved the mystery, but now what?
That's the exciting part. Remember Flo with her hand-washing tantrums? We know those tantrums are serving a purpose. The author suggests that if it's about her wanting to escape the lead up to lunch, maybe the demands or sensory overload, we need to focus on that why, not just the tantrum itself.
So instead of making it a battle every time she needs to wash her hands, we could try letting her wash up earlier. Or we could teach her to ask for a break if she needs one. Or even try making lunchtime more enjoyable so she's not as desperate to escape.
Exactly. It's about shifting from just reacting to the behavior to proactively changing the environment or teaching new skills.
It's like instead of trying to put out a fire every time we're trying to figure out how to stop it from starting in the first place.
I love that analogy. And the solutions can be really creative. They talk about this case study with Brian, whose challenging behaviors were all over the place: aggression, property destruction, tantrums, you name it. Turns out all of that was driven by a mix of things: attention, escape, and tangible reinforcement.
Wow. So multiple functions at play.
Right. But because they figured out what those functions were, they were able to come up with this multi-pronged approach. They taught Brian how to request breaks, they replaced timeouts with more proactive strategies, and they started giving him way more positive reinforcement when he was behaving appropriately.
So it's like they created this personalized plan to address all the different factors driving his behavior.
Yeah.
What I'm getting from all of this is that FBA isn't about labeling people or trying to make bad behaviors disappear. It's about really understanding the individual and figuring out solutions that work for them.
Absolutely. It's about ditching that one-size-fits-all mentality and really embracing the fact that behavior is complex.
Speaking of complex, let's do a quick recap of the key takeaways from our deep dive into FBA. Number 1, behavior isn't random. It always serves a purpose, even if we don't get it right away.
Number 2, FBA gives us the tools we need to figure out the why behind the behavior. Functional analysis, descriptive assessment, indirect assessment, these are all like clues that help us crack the code.
And number 3, and this might be the most important one, interventions should be as unique as the people they're designed for. It's all about finding the right approach, or a combination of approaches that meet each person's individual needs.
And being flexible, right? Because what works now might need to change later on.
So true. It's like we're all students in the School of Behavior, always learning and adapting our strategies as we go. And on that note of lifelong learning, we're going to wrap up this deep dive. Be sure to join us next time when we'll be exploring a whole new topic and uncovering even more fascinating insights. Until then, keep those detective hats handy and never stop questioning the why behind the behavior.